Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony FX3. This camera retails for a little under $3,900 US. I'll include a link in the description, and I'll start off the review by letting all of you know I love this thing. Now, many of you are already saying you reviewed the A7S III. It's an A7S III with a different design. You're right, it is a very different design, a much better design for video shooting. And the upside is it can still take the exact same stills as the A7S III. The downside, you did lose the EVF, but I think it's a change that is still in favor of video shooters that predominantly are going to use this for video and not still capabilities. So what makes this better than the A7S III for someone like me? First and foremost, the cage-free design. We've got Q20 mounts all over the body, and that is something I really like. Also, the grip is larger, and even though my hands didn't grow since I reviewed the A7S III, this is, ergonomically speaking, a far better match, I think, for most users. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if Sony starts implementing this design language to more of their E-mount cameras. And that is where we get to touch on design. This has the look and feel, or really the overall aesthetic of the FX lineup, but of course it's married now to the E-mount Alpha lineup in terms of form factor. And that's the beauty of this camera. You don't have that with the A7S III. The A7S III is still amazing, but this is just better if all you plan to really do is shoot video. And remember, you can still shoot stills just as well as you can with the A7S III. The other big thing is the active cooling on board here. Now, some of you may think of this as just a reliability issue, but I will assure you it's more than that. It's real. And I say that because I've done quite a bit of traveling in my life and I've seen quite a few overheats, and knowing that there's active cooling on this is really important. Even inside studios, when you think of recording with things like Blackmagic cameras, things get hot, right? This has different levels to manage that. So, in the event that you're using this on tripod, you can, essentially turn the cooling off if you're not worried about it because you're not touching it. But if you are, doing some run and gun style stuff and you don't want to get burnt, and I'm not saying this camera will burn you, but Blackmagic users know what I'm talking about, having the active cooling is going to make a difference. So that's some important stuff that you should know out of the gate. It's not just about overheating, it's about usability and form following function and not getting burnt by the equipment you're using. Now, just like many other manufacturers, Sony said, how do we make this different than the A7S III when it has the same sensor, same codecs? Even S-Cinetone is now available on the A7S III. So right here with the shutter button, we now actually can control zoom, which is great if you have powered zoom lenses like this big guy right here, which I did demo with this, and the 16-35 cinema lens from Sony is great. It's also expensive, but that's to be expected. It's also not a fantastic match in terms of form factor for something this compact, which is part of the beauty of the FX3, but it works really well. And I may show that, just the zoom capability, but again, this just tells you Sony is aware, and we're actively thinking, how can we satisfy video users? And giving you power zoom control here is great. It also can default to clear image zoom in the event you're using something prime, like this wide angle 14mm G Master, which is also really fantastic on this camera. And that's part of the beauty, is that even though I wouldn't want to use the 12 megapixel sensor for still imaging, you can, and it still does a great job. It's just not ideal if you are looking to shoot landscape or something to that effect. Now, in terms of other things that are really important, I'm praising this camera a lot already, but we know it doesn't have the EVF. Some people will miss that. What you do need to know is that I said it wasn't perfect, and a lot of people will argue it's not even a true cinema camera because, it does have the omission, the lack of DCI 4K. It doesn't have time code. It doesn't have waveform. There's no shutter angle, and of course, no ND filter. The FX6 has those things, and a lot of people will say, how is this part of the cinema line if it's missing that? Now, I would argue that in spite of missing those things, you have to remember its form factor. It does have IBIS, and what other offerings in this capacity have IBIS and ND filter built in? Nothing. Also, the screen, touch screen, and fully articulating is really small. This would be my biggest gripe with this camera. Battery life is good, not amazing, but I think better than pretty much anything else in its class. But again, this screen is really small. The onboard audio is very good. It does come with, which I've kept out of frame, of course, an XLR adapter that also doubles as a handle for the camera, attaches to the hot shoe, eats 2 of the quarter 20 mounts, but gives you 3 quarter 20 mounts as a result of being mounted on and used as a grip. So I think that most users are going to love this. And if you are shooting video exclusively with this, you likely are shooting with an XLR mic. And then you have the ability to switch the XLR microphones on and off, because this does have an analog audio port on this side. I pointed to the card slots, which I'll get to shortly, and I think that's really convenient. Now, whether or not you use a Sony mic is another question altogether, but not really getting into that. So this is great to have. I wish that Sony gave us an option on the XLR handle on the grip, because that would just make this camera even more affordable if you don't plan on using it. Because remember, they still have their little digital shotgun, which of course works with this and works really well, but is no true substitute for an XLR mic. Now, beyond that, another important thing to know is that when going over the feature set, the specifications that you would want to think about when saying, well, why not save the money with an A7S III? The audio on here, with the XLR adapter, you're going to get 24-bit sound that you're not going to get with the A7S III, obviously. And in addition to that, I think the preamps are better here. Also, another thing that you want to be aware of are all of the tally lights. Having a tally light here when it's recording, as well as on the front of the camera, even the record button lighting up, are all things that signal to you, again, this is a very video-centric camera. You're not going to get that with the A7S III. Now, some of you may not care about that. I'm not one of those people. And just to show you that, there it is hot. So I really like that. An interesting thing, though, is that you also get a record button on the front of the camera, which I think is great. So there's no question whether this is recording. And on camera right now, as I record this, the lights are looking a little bit yellow, but they do appear as red. I can assure you of that. I'll go ahead and stop that right now. But that's another critical feature to me. I think it's really important to know whether or not you're recording, both for your subject and for whoever is doing the filming. And that's something you're getting with the FX3 that you aren't going to see on the A7S III. In addition to that, the zoom rocker that I mentioned already, I think people think that's not a big deal, but it is. And a lot of people think that because they're using prime glass to do all of their recording. But because the autofocus system here is so good, I think you're going to be more inclined to use power zooms than you may have thought originally. So that's another thing to take into account. And having basically enough batteries is something I highly recommend. You're going to probably want to pick up 3 batteries if you're planning to do a decent amount of shooting with this, because you're going to get a little over an hour of 4K, at least 10-bit internally on this thing. One thing I do wish that this supported, which it does not, is writing to an external disk drive. So using an NVMe, like a lot of the Sabrents that I've featured on my channel, you can't do it. And being that this does have a cage-free design, I really would welcome that without any issue. Another thing is that, if you haven't noticed, very video-centric on the back of this camera. So peaking, display, shutter, zebra, these are things that you wouldn't necessarily expect or you're not going to get at all on the A7S III. And this camera, top to bottom, has been designed to shoot video. However, when it comes to the mode, I wish we had a dial. Instead, we are relying on a touchscreen, and it leaves a bit to be desired. So maybe next gen we'll get a larger touchscreen that also we hopefully will have an actual mode dial. I think that could have been incorporated here, but maybe it was in part because Sony wanted to give us the cage free design, and any mode dial would have gotten in the way. That's all I can think of. We have programmable buttons. We have the same white balance in the that you'll find in the A7S III. Basically all of the niceties, but again, with a design that is completely video-centric, that leaves really nothing left out. You know, again, the lack of 24p and DCI 4K, I think, are the biggest gripes that you can have with this from a video perspective, because how can a cinema camera be missing those things? That means it's not really a cinema camera. But when you see the quality that this camera outputs, and again, the autofocus prowess, A7S III, but with all of the design language pointing to video usage, it really makes this thing hard not to love. Now, the I/O, pretty straightforward. Microphone and headphone jack, Type-C, and the multi-port, which, believe it or not, I still use here in 2021. It still happens. Some people, I guess, think it's ridiculous. It still gets used. Full-size HDMI port, again, the same thing you'd find on the A7S III. The menu system, same as the A7S III and A1. And you do have some of the niceties from the A1 on here that you don't have on the A7S III, like the ability to leave the camera on and stand by infinitely, as opposed to it timing out after 30 minutes and going into power save and shutting off. But we don't get any bracket to protect the HDMI like you do with the A7S III, which is a little bit of a head scratcher considering this is supposed to be the exclusively video-centric version, really, of the A7S III. But remember, this is Gen 1, and I think that for a Gen 1 camera, Sony did a fantastic job. And that's not something you can always say about Gen 1 products. Single mount point on the bottom of this brick, that's another thing. Build quality here is fantastic. You know, if you thought the A or Alpha line of cameras had good build quality, wait until you hold one of these, because the grip is better and it just feels like a tank in a way that I can't say even the A1 that I have here, which is a $6,500 body, and it's really solid, but it's just overall the FX3 does have a tank-like build that I would love to see across the entire Alpha line of cameras. I love the record button up here. The joystick up here is clearly designed for a top-down user experience. You would traditionally find that on the back of the camera, like with the A7S III. But if you're using the included handle, which is what this is literally designed for, then obviously you now see why the joystick is here. And the expectation is for the camera to be used in this capacity. Now, another thing, and part of the reason I keep mentioning I wish we had a larger display, besides the fact that it's touchscreen and it's a little bit small to navigate, is that, of course, if you're using an external monitor with this, which you're going to without hesitation and likely will mount it here, or if you're not using the XLR adapter, of course, you'll have it mounted on the top of the unit, you are somewhat undoing the form factor. But anyone who's going to tell me that this undoes the camera and, you know, they prefer an FX6, I think you've lost your mind a little bit, because this is still infinitely smaller than an FX6, even with, of course, an external monitor on here. I'm having a little trouble threading that. But at any rate, that's something that I want to dispel the myth of that, you know, if you put an external monitor on here, you've blown up the form factor. You haven't. This is still incredibly small. If you want to put this on a gimbal, this is ideal. An FX6 is not ideal. And anyone who's looking for, again, a video beast to put on a gimbal, this is going to be better than the A7S III, in my opinion. And then having the active cooling just puts it over the top. Again, from a usability, practical standpoint of actually handling the camera. Now, when we talk about, you know, what lenses to put on here, let me actually unthread that because I did thread one side. And again, I think that if Sony really intends to bring people on board that generally shy away from the FX lineup, and this is the entry point rather than it just being a B cam for existing FX users, then I think excluding the XLR would be in Sony's favor, because again, that just would make this camera, you know, possibly $3,500 and put it right there next to the A7S III. And there wouldn't be any cannibalization of either product line, in my opinion. But just to give you an idea of what this looks like, obviously with lenses on it, because I'm assuming you'll want to see that. Again, I did shoot quite a bit with the 16 to 35. In fact, my review of the HP Omen 30L was shot with this combo. The lighting wasn't perfect, but it was still incredible because without even pulling focus, it pretty much kept everything in focus. A little bit of breathing here and there, but completely on auto. And that is amazing. And again, battery life was really solid. One thing you should know about battery life that I almost forgot to mention as I'm zooming inadvertently with the zoom toggle right there, you can see it moving, which is another thing I love about this camera. This part, not so much. If you want to use a dummy battery, there is no good way to do that because there is no way to, no eject button for the battery cover. So be aware of that. That's something that I think is important. If you think you're going to use a dummy battery, you can, but this is not going to go away. So it's just something to be aware of. I don't know if that is something that can be addressed in the aftermarket, but right now, you can see there is no way to release that. So something to be aware of when using a dummy battery. And I didn't want to forget that. And I don't have any written notes here. So that's just the way I shoot, figuratively and literally. So this was a great pairing. Again, having control of your zoom is phenomenal. You're not going to get this out of the A7S III. A lot of you are going to say, Ed, I shoot with primes. I don't care. I get it. But for those of us that like to use a power zoom occasionally, create a little more dramatic cinematic shots that you can't accomplish with static prime lenses, this is going to change the game. And that's really the whole beauty of this camera. It is, from a run and gun standpoint, it changes the game in many ways. So I use this lens quite a bit. Put that over there. Another lens I used a lot was the kit cinema lens, which I think doesn't get the street cred it deserves. It isn't quite wide enough at 28, but the 28 to 135 range is pretty damn good. And at $2,500, it's very affordable and does well on stills, not just video. So I still really like this lens. I don't see myself giving it up. The 16 to 35 is wide enough, but again, the price is a tough one to swallow. I think the most popular lens to use with this camera is the one that I primarily shot with the majority of the time, which I don't own, but is incredibly popular for good reason, incredibly versatile, great image quality across the board, the 24 to 70 G Master. And, it's a solid performer, retails now for around $2,000. And I don't think you can go wrong with this kit. I mean, you're going to be able to shoot anything you want. Let me get the monster out of the way with this lens. And the image quality, again, both, of course, on the video side is stellar. Everything I shot was 10-bit, 4K 60. But, of course, 4K 120, you want to do it, you can do it. Full HD, you want to go up to 240, just like the A7S III, you can do it. But, again, you've got a video-centric body that knows you want to shoot video. And there is something to be appreciated about that. Not perfect. I've mentioned the things that are missing. But of course, things like waveform that are missing, as soon as you put on an external monitor, which you're going to do, let's be real, you gain that. Now, the card bay here has 2 slots, just like all of the modern current Alpha bodies. And it does support, of course, compact flash express type A cards, Sony's tough cards. This is a 160 gig card. I think it runs about $400. And so while I wish that this body supported NVMe SSDs like most cinema cameras, and this is food for thought, Sony is selling these. So this is basically a portable NVMe, except the pricing is not similar. I mean, $400 for a 160 gig card, $400 will buy you, several terabytes of NVMe storage. This is more practical, but not from a cost perspective. And then you'll also want to pick up Sony's card reader for this. But you can use UHS-2 cards and capture 4K at 60 frames, 10-bit without any issue. And that's another thing. I mean, established with the A7S III, codec support is great, so you're not going to have any issues. But I would really like a bigger screen. I'm going to say that over and over again because when you jump into the menu system and really start to go to work, things are just really cramped. You have to have small hands. I mean, I can't imagine with large hands, which I do not have. I'll go with medium size here, folks. I don't know how you would really sort through things. It would be tough. But the menu system redo that we got, previous gen cameras, A7S III, A1, is here alive and well, and it does a good job. So all in all, who do I think this is for? I think that, Sony got it right. This is for people that are video centric. The A7S III, again, I think whet the appetite. I think that people, had they had a choice, had they known that this was going to be an option, would have waited. I'm glad I did, because while the A7S III is an amazing camera, this one is better for my use. And if you go to user reviews of this camera across the board, I don't think I've ever seen a satisfaction rate as high as this. Maybe the A7S III, but this didn't exist. Now that it does, I think things are kind of moot. I think that anyone who didn't buy the A7S III will prefer this, and I think anyone who did will kind of wish they had waited, but, I can't do anything other than blame Sony. The power button is slightly problematic. It's just, I wish they had extended the actual switch here a little bit more, but that's really nitpicking, kind of like a lot of the other things that I've done in this review, because for me to really say that battery life could be better is a major nitpick. For me to say that the LCD should be bigger is also a nitpick. The lack of EVF, again, if you really need it, go with the A7S III. You'll save money and you'll get a feature that isn't here. But if you want to shoot video, I just don't know why you would pick the A7S III over this, other than the pricing. And again, you're getting this. So that kind of makes up for things unless you don't plan to use this at all. And again, all the design elements are much better for shooting video, whether this is sitting on a tripod or your running gun. Ergonomics are better. The buttons are dedicated to video use. I just don't see why you wouldn't want it. And again, you can always shoot stills with this. And the 12 megapixels, well, it's not going to compare to my A7R IV, but it will still outperform anything else that, I might have in my gear bag other than my A7R IV. So that's the pro it's got going for it. So while I don't see myself using this that much outside of the studio for the channel, I might be shocked and I might end up using this as a travel camera. That's the beauty of the FX3, is that it's a video tool, but I like it so much I could see myself shooting with it. And I did shoot some stills, but again, that wouldn't be my primary use for it. So I wouldn't pitch it as a still camera ever. But Sony did a great job here. I mean, video quality is phenomenal thanks to the autofocus system and years of work. You've got a wide array of lenses. That's the other beautiful thing. You don't have to use cinema lenses. I think this is really more appealing to people coming from a Blackmagic camera that didn't feel even the A7S III was competition for it. But now, with a body like this, cage-free, and yeah, come on, cages are not that expensive. They're not a big deal, but that's another way to reduce the footprint. And it's built like a tank. You've got so many lenses to choose from. Really like this one on it, by the way. The 14mm G Master, brand new offering, $1,600. You want a wide shot with this, you've got it. I think Sony hit it out of the park with the FX3. I don't think this camera is getting the respect it deserves. And yes, it does have the guts of an A7S III, but it has the body. If an FX were to exist in the Alpha lineup, Sony did exactly that. And that's why I like it so much, and that's likely why it will be my next camera. And, even though cameras like the Sigma FPL exist, which are smaller and have a higher megapixel count, and actually do have DCI 4K, and actually can record to an NVMe drive, it doesn't have the autofocus system. It doesn't have the lens lineup. It doesn't have the overall performance that this camera has. It does have active cooling, though. And it doesn't have the flip out screen, which is another great thing. But I love this thing. If that didn't come across, then you weren't listening or watching. The FX3 is a winner, and I highly recommend it. And I likely will pick one up very soon. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. And please stay safe. Did I already say that? Maybe. Later.